Hi, welcome to this panel on corruption and trust, the role of institutions. We have with us today Gert Buchart and Luis Souza, who we thank having promptly accepted our invitation to be speakers on this panel. Let me just take this moment also to thank ENAJUS for having invited me to moderate it. It's a great pleasure and honor. And last but not the least, thank you all for attending, both of you who are physically here and all of those who are following on YouTube. A few words about our invited speakers. Gert is a professor at the Public Governance Institute at KU Leuven, where he currently holds several other positions. He also holds a number of scientific and unofficial positions, such as being the honorary professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose of the UCL, vice chair of the UN ECOSOC Committee of Experts on Public Administration, chair of the OECD Network of Schools of Government, just to mention a few. Gert is also a member of various editorial and advisory boards of the highest ranked journals in public administration and administrative sciences, like Public Administration Review, for example, where he has been consistently publishing his own research. Just from 2020 onwards, he published 2 papers in Public Administration Review, another 2 on International Review of Administrative Sciences, and another one in International Journal of Public Sector Management. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, as I'm not even mentioning the numerous chapters in books. Luis Souza got his PhD in political science at the European University Institute in 2002. His thesis title was Corruption, Assessing Ethical Standards in Political Life Through Control Policies. In 2003, he was awarded the Gulbenkian Prize for Young Researchers. He is currently research fellow at ICS Universidade de Lisboa, but before that, he was professor of political science in several national and international universities, from Aveiro University to University of Gothenburg, passing by Harvard University in the meantime, again, just to mention a few. He's coordinated of Anchorage Net, a research network on anti-corruption agencies, and founding member and former chairperson of Transparency International Portugal. He's also a local research correspondent on corruption for the European Commission and acts as a consultant to various international governmental organizations on corruption control. He has produced expert opinions on corruption and on corruption control legislation, carried out feasibility studies, institutional capacity assessments, sectoral risk assessments, and national integrity system assessments to various foreign governments on behalf of the European Commission, OECD, Sigma, Council of Europe, and UNDP. He has several publications on the topic in international publishers and indexed journals. About the topic that we will be discussing today, corruption and trust, the role of institutions. For long that the need to reform the public sector is recognized, including the reform of the executive branch and more specifically the judicial branch. More recently, the focus and drivers of the reform policies include trust and trustworthiness of the systems, institutions, and organizations. In this context, Gert Buchart will speak to us about reforming for trust, arguing that trust, justice, reform is essential for the whole of society. Gert, in his own chapter on European perspectives for public administration, The Way Forward, published in 2020, quoting Al Gore, says that there are only the politics of fear and the politics of trust. If reforming justice has been a difficult undertaking, it should nonetheless remain a fundamental goal. Utopias could be a remedy against fear, and they do become reality. As Gert argues, as a social science technique, Utopia helps us look at potentials for realization and possible futures. Moreover, to the extent that justice system makes trust in other institutions possible, reforming for trust and making the judicial system more trustworthy is paramount to the whole society. This could take us to the discussion about how a trusting relationship between the individuals and the judicial system develops, or more generally, to the justice-trust link. Is it more in the eyes of the perceiver, or is it essentially a responsibility of the receiver of that trust? This also relates to the correlation between distributive justice, the perceived fairness of outcomes, and procedural justice, perceived fairness of rules and decision processes used to determine outcomes. In the same way that workers' expectations about being treated fairly in the workplace by their bosses is influenced by the trust they have on them, for example, litigants and the general public's expectations about being treated fairly in a courtroom depends on the trust they place on the judicial system. In these examples, trust is a determinant of justice. However, one could also think of trust as an outcome of justice. In other words, although there is a correlation between these two concepts, justice and trust, causality and its direction are more difficult to establish. Related to this, Gert will go through 3 models of performance and trust, including a circular model of trust. More specifically, Gert will give an overview of both endogenous and exogenous drivers of trust in justice. Trust in the judiciary is an important part in guaranteeing court independence, which in turn reinforces trust. Garopa and Magalhães, in a paper published this year, show that judicial independence fosters trust in legal systems, especially among those who are more aware about the judicial system. A transparent and accountable judiciary of high integrity is one of the prerequisites for the proper functioning of the rule of law. Besides the justice system, the European Commission identifies 3 other pillars for ensuring the rule of law: the anti-corruption framework, media pluralism, and other institutional checks and balances. As the European Commission points out, these 4 pillars are interdependent. Also, trust and corruption are intertwined insofar as corruption is negatively associated with an individual's perception of fairness and generalized trust. Looking at the concept reversely related to corruption, accountability, Garopa and Magalhães, in the paper I just mentioned, find accountability positively associated with trust in the legal system. Therefore, the fight against corruption, namely through increased accountability, would contribute to build up trust, which conversely can help keep corruption low. Our second speaker, Luís Souza, will speak to us about the anti-corruption framework. Along with the judicial system, active civil society plays an important role in the scrutiny of both public and private affairs, detecting possible corruption and integrity breaches, raising awareness and promoting integrity. He will look at the difficulty in the fight against corruption in a specific context, the workplace. Based on his results, he argues that job precariousness will impact negatively on the employees' willingness to report corruption, and that a more encompassing perception-based definition of corruption by employees is likely to have a positive effect on corruption disclosure at the workplace. Before passing the word to our speakers, a few words about how the session will proceed. So after passing the word to Gert and then to Luís, which have up to 45 minutes for their presentations, the floor is open for questions. Those who are here, please raise your hand physically so that we can see you. And those who are following online, please post your questions and I will go through them in the end. And now, without further delays, I'll pass the word to Gert. The floor is yours.
So good morning, everybody, or good day. Also our friends in Brazil, on the other side of the water. I think we have a shared issue of justice, that it functions properly. And I first of all would like to thank ENAJUS for inviting me, and I would like to congratulate ENAJUS and all those participating and contributing to that for such a very relevant topic. I think even for Western countries, the obvious is not always obvious anymore, and I think we should pay very much attention to that. Trust that justice and trust and corruption are in the right perspective. Let me start with actually already with some of the conclusions and with an element which refers to Lisbon, and I should congratulate Portugal really for its COVID strategy with the best performance in the European scene. And it was today in the newspapers in Belgium. Why is Portugal so effective? And it has to do with the logic of consequences, of results. People, and so they gave two arguments here. First of all, Vice Admiral Henrique Gouveia Melo, he was trusted, and the procedures to organize the vaccination by his team, but also the quality of the first-line health system in Portugal. The trust, so it's about the trust in the institutions and the policies that have resulted, according to that report, the effectiveness of vaccination. So that's the logic of results. But there's a second logic which I would like to illustrate too. It's about the feeling of being excluded. So people have to trust institutions, and that's the logic of appropriateness. We have to have systems that behave in an appropriate way, not just corruption, I think that will come back, but the appropriateness of policies. And let me just quote one of your major poets, Pessoa, and I will say, what does he say? Cortei a laranja em duas, e as duas partes não podiam ficar iguais, para qual fui injusto. Oi que vou comer ambas. So he's actually saying, I've been cutting an orange in two, and the parts are indifferent. They're not equal parts. And then the question is, has this been unjust? And then he raises the question, is it unjust if I have the two parts of the orange? And so it's about exclusion and the feeling of exclusion of society. And I think that's a logic of appropriateness. And I think I will come back to that to illustrate how with reforms, we should actually focus on trust, and trusting just reforms should lead to trusting justice reforms. That's actually my point. How do I move to the next one? So I have 4 parts in my intervention. I will say something about trends and reforms and shifting in the public sphere. Then I will talk about, and my colleague Clara already mentioned some models and concepts. Then trusting justice and trusting reform. When we look at the reform agenda in OECD countries for the future, we will have to watch three simultaneous things: delivering routine services, coping with expected and unexpected crises, and reinventing and innovating possible futures. That's the innovation part. Previously, up to now, we had a model where we had standard operating procedures, then a crisis, which we solved, then again standard operating procedures, then again another crisis. I think this paradigm is past time. I think we will have to organize in the future, from now on, that simultaneously we have to deliver services and we have to cope in a chronicle way with a crisis. So this is like not a sequence, but a simultaneity and a parallel. I think that's a very important change in the conception of how to organize our whole of government system here and how to do that. And the context here has to do with a legitimacy of the state. Even in the European Union, we have to focus on that. Unfortunately, we still have to explicitly focus on that, on the legitimacy of the state. And for the lawyers here, we are here in a very legal environment for this conference. I think it's so crucial to emphasize the state of law, l'état de droit, the Rechtsstaat in our European system. And that's not just elections and decisions, it's also about a performing and inclusive public sector. The second thing is, of course, that we have to combine logics of consequences, I mentioned to that, results, with logics of appropriateness, which is proper behavior. Proper behavior becomes very important. And that leads to trust. And that's actually the focus of what I want to talk about. When we look at how trust is constructed, I will unpack that partly and link it to justice too, of course. The logic of consequences is a logic of a public sector which is part of the solution and creates results. That means managing resources from all points of view. But it means delivering the services to the right group of people at the right time, in the right proportions, for the right reasons, and that could lead to trust. The second thing is the logic of appropriateness. That's a very important issue too. We should not just, results are necessary but not sufficient at all. So appropriateness, and my colleague De Souza will certainly talk about the corruption issue, which is part of appropriateness. But I define appropriateness not just at the individual level, which is your individual integrity. It's also organizational integrity, which means you have a culture of openness, a culture of delivery, a culture of being responsible and accountable, a culture of being citizen-oriented, a culture of being part of that solution. And the third part is policy integrity. It means your policies should be appropriate. And that's about exclusion and inclusion. It's one of the common denominators of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I could refer to SDG 16, which is about strong institutions, peace and justice. That is about inclusion. We should not leave people behind or give them the impression to be left behind, and that leads to trust too. So that's an important element. So trust, we have always looked at trust a bit from the political science point of view as society trusting the public sector. But I think we should actually add this. It's also about trust of the public sector in society. And it's also about trust within the public sector. Now, why is that important? It's the three types of trust we should look at here. The three types of trust are actually important, and the reform strategies to build and keep trust should be at these three types of trust. Let me give you an example of how asymmetric this can be and how dysfunctional the asymmetry could be. The public sector says to its population, we want you to trust us, public sector. But of course, we don't trust you. That's a very strange position. Think of a marriage to say, I want you to trust me, but of course I don't trust you. I don't think that will stand very well. And then, of course, it's also about trust within the public sector. This is the trust of central government to local government. Does your central government trust local? It's about the Ministry of Finance for other ministries. It's the ministries vis-à-vis the agencies. It's the politics and the administration. And let me give a very simple example. We want partnerships. When we have to realize the SDGs, all the 17 SDGs by 2030, we will have to need partnerships. Also 16, justice, when we have to realize that justice, we need partnerships. And so how do you explain if you say public-private partnerships or public-public partnerships? All types with NGOs, with citizen communities, the citizens wanting to participate in police actions, wanting to give testimony, and all of that. You say, oh, you don't trust us, and we have to trust you. And if we have a partnership, you don't even have trust within your own public sector. Why would we as a private organization trust you? So it's very important to have these trust levels at the same level almost to make sure we have a sustainable system. Now, how could trust work? And I will give you 3 options here, 3 models, 3 pure models. It could be at the end of the pipeline. And that's the logic of consequences here, logic of results. If only you work very well, you give the right outputs, quality to the right people, and you have the results, an educated society, a healthy society, a secure society, which is important in the justice context, then we can assume that trust will come. People will trust the security policies, the judicial policies, they will trust the courts, if only the consequences are there. That's one model. Trust at the end of the pipeline. Question mark. We could have trust actually also at the beginning of the pipeline. It's a kind of social capital. It means actually, because you trust the public sphere and the public sector, the public service, first you want to work for it. I mean, it's very important that we attract the fine fleur, the fine, the very good, competent people to the public sector. It also impacts the willingness to pay taxes when there is trust at the beginning. It also impacts the capacity to mobilize volunteers for all types of services, volunteers in the public sphere. These are indicators of trust as social capital at the beginning, which it gives an input, and then you have your logic of consequences. And of course, when we combine the two, at the end of the pipeline or at the beginning of the pipeline, it's actually a circular model. And this circular model is very important. This circular model, let's see, the slides do not follow. All right, yes. The circular model shows actually that trust is not just a dependent variable, but also an independent variable. It's alpha and omega at the same time. So that makes it a bit complex, not impossible, but complex to say, how do we build and keep trust? It means it's about input issues. Input means, for example, hiring people. Is there a perception that there is a fair possibility for all levels of society, all classes, if you use that word, for all parts of society to have access to the public sector? Question mark. Also to justice. Activities, the transparency of procedures, the speed of these procedures, the activities itself lead to trust. The outputs, which is the court cases themselves, lead to trust. The outcome, how does it impact behavior of a society? That leads to trust. And you see, all these elements should be taken into account. And if you look at empirical studies, they actually all play in the as variables which impact trust in the public sector in general, but in justice in particular. Now, let me talk a bit about models and concepts here. There are actually two big paradigms if we talk about trust. The first paradigm is to say trust and distrust are like on one dimension. So you move between high trust and high distrust on one dimension. That's actually one paradigm. And so there are like, you fluctuate between them. But there's a second paradigm, and I'm an advocate of this second paradigm. It actually says you simultaneously have two dimensions, a trust dimension and a distrust dimension. So you see, you can actually combine at the same time high trust and high distrust. You see here the dots on this scheme here. It's an empirical study we did to ask people about indicators to say, to what extent do you have trust? To what extent do you have distrust? We see actually, it's not just that you have, when there is high distrust, that there is low trust, or when there is high trust, that there is low distrust. That's not necessarily the case. You have other combinations. And I think intuitively you understand that too. After the banking crisis, the collapse of the banks, you still have money in your bank. So we have to trust the banks, but we have to distrust the banks at the same time. And so I think it's just a little life experience example to say, simultaneously we can have trust and distrust for different reasons and for different angles. But I think it's important to qualify that and to look at it. And I think it's important also for the judicial systems, for institutions in general, to look what are the drivers of trust, what are the drivers of distrust, because they are not the same. And we have to, if we want to keep trust or build trust, we have to increase trust and decrease distrust, which is two different policies. Another element on trust is about what are the major components of trust. And I will give an example from the judicial area where we did research too. We talk about the ABI model, ability, benevolence, and integrity. So the basis, what are the foundations to build trust, or quasi-core to reduce distrust? It's about ability, so people are competent, it's a competent organization. Benevolence, the second base pillar, it's about goodwill. And the third is integrity, which of course refers to the corruption issue clearly, but not just the corruption, it's beyond that, as I told you, the integrity of the organization and its culture and philosophy, and also the integrity of the policies here. And let me give an example, a very concrete example, which we did in our research within justice. It's on child protection, which is or child abuse, if you want, which is a terrible thing, obviously. And what we did in that research is, the organizing child protection is about sharing information between, social services and the prosecutor and the prisons and so on. And so it's about sharing very difficult information on child abuse and how to protect children. So if we apply these ability, benevolence, and integrity, we actually find it we find it in that research. There are three types of information that are exchanged. The first one is legally compulsory information. So you have to share the information. It's legally compulsory. Well, we found out that the trust on that part of sharing information is based on ability, on competence. I trust the information that is shared to take decisions within the justice, child justice here, child protection justice, because it's a competent authority that is doing it. So the competence is the base of it. the legally compulsory exchange information. The second part is discretionary sharing of information. You may share it, but you don't have to. Now that is based on benevolence. I give you the information. I trust you will use this information because there is goodwill. I perceive goodwill. That's the second part of trusting, to share. You know, you get this information even if I don't have to give it to you. The third thing, which was very, that you can't do that research in quantitative, it's qualitative research. You say, we are legally not allowed to share this information. It's legally forbidden to share this information. Is it happening? Yes, it is happening. But it's happening on the basis of integrity. You say, I cannot give you this information at all. Legally, I'm not allowed to do that. But I will give you this information because I know your agency, your person is integrity. And so in the interest of the child, I will give you this information, which I'm not supposed to give. And you see clearly that the different dimensions of ability, benevolence, and integrity are so crucial, not just in general, but also within justice to make things happen. Another way to look at the trust issue in the public sector in general, but in justice in particular, it's the levels, it's macro trust, meso trust, and micro trust. And again, this is very important. Micro trust is at the level of the transactions. It can be, of course, local government, the service transactions itself, it's about perceptions, and so it's actually the court decisions and the court interactions, very operational in some cases. The meso level is about public policies in general, security policies, for example, or prosecuting policies, you know, which should be clear and visible and coherent. And the third is the macro trust. It's systemic. Easton calls it diffuse trust. Do you trust the judicial? Sometimes you have these surveys. Do you trust justice? That's a kind of mythical issue. You know, it's a very, the challenge here is that the sum of the micro is not the meso, and the sum of the meso is not the macro. So you need actually per level, you need a macro strategy, you need a meso strategy, and you need a micro strategy to build and to keep the trust levels here. Now let me shift to the trusting justice. So I talked about, you know, the models, how to approach this, the intellectual framework, so to speak, which is empirically corroborated. Trusting justice. So the judicial chain, it's actually about the judicial chain that we need to talk. And that means, of course, we have to unpack justice, to unpack the justice production function chain here, which means actually we have to, there's a kind of contamination here in the perceptions and the feelings. Say it's not just the prosecutor's office or the court decisions. It's actually much broader. It's police, it's prisons, it's social services. And so this complex chain, it makes a kind of global perception, which for citizens is sometimes difficult to distinguish and certainly to separate. Especially since we have the different judicial branches itself, so family law, penal law, commercial, administrative. So you have to unpack that, and I think it's important to make sure that is visible. Let me give you some figures, facts and figures, just as a kind of empirical evidence that what I have been saying is to a certain extent corroborated, but not entirely. So it's, there's a lot of unknown here too. On this graph, which you will see, it's linking reported crime and the confidence in police. It's a research done in 2012 by the Social Cultural Planning Bureau in the Netherlands. The Social Cultural Planning Bureau in the Netherlands. They have done this kind of research. They have done replications of that too. The dots you see are countries. I know it's a bit difficult for you to see this, and I apologize for that, but I'm sure you will get the PowerPoints here. Actually, what is the conclusion of this graph? As you see, the line is going through it is the correlation of reported crime and confidence in police. And so actually the correlation is you know, the confidence in the police rest is the same whether the reported crime is low or high. So that doesn't seem not to impact it. So that's a fact which we have to take into account. The question is, what does it mean for our policies or for our communication here? That's reported crime and confidence in justice. So not police, but justice. And here you see a negative correlation. So it means the higher the reported crime, the lower the confidence in justice. However, this correlation is not significant. So that's another interesting conclusion here. And you see, because the divergence is the span is to what width here. So we're not allowed to make a conclusion here. And you see that there are huge differences in a way. So if you look at, you know, France, but I don't have the pointer, but France and Finland, for example, for the same level of reported crime, the confidence in justice varies between 40% for France and 80% for Finland. So it shows clearly that the span, even in Europe, between European countries, is huge. And so that means that other variables are important. So it means that we are not looking at the right dimensions here, or we have to qualify and add some dimensions here. I also want to mention another study, which we did in 2015. It was a study which was commissioned by the OECD. It's interesting that the OECD also emphasizes, which is an economic organization, OECD, but OECD also suddenly said justice becomes part of the system. And so for a long time, OECD has been focusing on the executive part of the government, and then on the legislative, and now also on the judiciary in a way. If you look at the scheme here, the green dot is the trust in justice. The blue dots are exogenous, are external to justice. The yellow ones are internal to justice. I will just go through them. So for you to have an idea how trust in justice is affected according to empirical research. This is a summary of empirical research, sometimes even quantitative empirical research. When we look at the internal variables here, the yellow dots, then there is a link, and I will qualify it in the next slides, between the type of contacts. So it's very important when you talk to citizens, the type of contact is important. The communication is crucial. The communication is crucial. I mean, the old saying, not only justice should be done, it should be seen to be done. Not only justice should be done, it should be seen to be done. That applies enormously in the trust topic here. Effectiveness, yes, that's a variable too. Reliability, but reliability is a bit of an ambiguous word here. What does it mean, reliability? It's actually the reliability of and the predictability of court decisions is an important one. Access to justice is important. I will come back to that in a later scheme. Access to justice is important. OECD has been emphasizing that. This is actually about the feeling of people that they don't have access to justice. And that's terrible for the trust in justice, to have the feeling and the perception that you don't have access to justice. Trust, access to the services in general, as OECD defines, I will come back to that too, has to do with geographical access, so the distance, financial access, and informational access. So OECD has developed indicators to assess the access perception here. And I will come back to that later. Visibility is also a variable, an internal factor, to make it seen. So the question of perception becomes important. Integrity, a very clear element on the internal side. Transparency is important. So the closed shops shouldn't be there. It should be kind of, it has to do with the motivation of court decisions and the accessibility of the motivation of court decisions and the coherence of this. Fairness, the feeling of fairness, this has to do with appropriateness, of course. A fair decision, which you can explain, is important. So the perception of fairness, procedural quality, so in the steps, is important. Responsiveness, so when there is a question, there is an answer or a reply, is an important element. And critical incidences, it's about scandals, of course. This is the, so these are all the yellow dots which you see, which all impact trust in justice. But then there is also the blue dots, and that escapes the judicial branch because it has to do with the whole of government and even beyond the whole of society here. I gave the reference in the previous scheme between Finland and France. Well, they're both Western Europe, but they have a huge difference as for the baseline of trust in society, for example. So the generalized trust, that's the first blue dot here, is an important one. The general culture of trust is an important one. That's why we have to be careful to compare countries. Greece is not Finland. What does that mean? That means that solutions that function in Finland probably wouldn't function in Greece and vice versa. So we have to take let's say, the generalized trust of a system into account. The economic context is important. That's the second blue dot here. So the GDP is important. It's a very element, so the welfare of a country actually impacts the trust in justice. It probably has to do with the resources that go, how many money do you invest in your justice? And that's a crucial point here. Demographics are important. Young people versus senior citizens have a different attitude vis-à-vis trust. And that has an impact. So the aging of a society is an important element here. The media is important. That's a fourth blue dot here. The role of the media and the independence of the media become important. I think what we are seeing now, and even in Western Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe, the independence of the press has a crucial role to play in the capacity to trust not just the public sector, whole of government, whole of society, but also particularly for justice here. And then the cultural context is also an element here. So these are all elements to qualify that. So the study, to continue with the same study, which is a study of 2015, based on all the empirical material available at that time, it's a study on the relationship between effective justice institutions, the rule of law, and trust in justice. I think to a certain extent, and here, but when you will receive the PowerPoint, you will see some of the correlations which are there. And this is not a consolidated model, but these are different studies. GDP per capita is GDP per capita is an important, is positively correlated to trust and justice. That's a fact. So ultimately it means how much money do you invest in justice? Government accountability is important too. Also has a positive correlation. So a culture of being accountable is important. To have a feeling of trust in justice, but trust in the public sphere in general. Responsibility and accountability. It's actually a difficult word. I always do an exercise of translations here. How do you translate responsibility in Portuguese? How do you translate accountability here? In many languages, actually the words are not differentiated. So it's even if there are two different and distinguished things here. Accountability is important here. Income inequality, that's a third one. Income inequality. Think of Pessoa's orange. You cut the orange in two and it's not equally in two. And then on top of that, you eat a whole orange. That's inequality. Well, that doesn't help to trust justice. It's a clear element that the higher the level of income inequality, the higher the distrust in justice. And the last point here is life satisfaction, which is a general cultural context here of the quality of life of scientists here. So this is a kind of refined analysis of what I have just said, and I will just do some cherry picking here so the green dot says trust and justice. And when you will receive the PowerPoint, you will see all the bilateral correlations. So it's not a consolidated model. And so from that point of view, you should be cautious in comparing and merging the conclusions here. But these are all the yellow ones. So it's about happening within justice in the broad sense. It has to do, I'll just list some of them. It's the limitations of powers by the judiciary, the strength of regulatory enforcement, the percentage of people who feel informed, how effective the enforcement is, the satisfaction with length of procedures, the absence of unreasonable delays, due process, the perception of corruption in the judiciary, the accessibility and effectiveness of alternative dispute resolution. All these elements have an impact on trust. That's an empirical statement. And that's important to take that into account. Now let me move to a third part of empirical materials to discuss this. Because ultimately the purpose is to reform, to push the right buttons, which enhance the trust and limit the distrust. So the general framework of OECD for serving citizens, and they have applied it to 3 policy fields: health, education, and justice. So and I invite you to go to one of the major documents that the OECD is publishing every 2 years. And I will referring to that. What I will show you will be too complex to explain, but at least I hope it triggers you and pushes you to look at government at a glance in 2021. So you can download it for free from the OECD website. Government at a glance gives a summary of all key data on the member countries of OECD, obviously including Portugal and in some cases also Brazil. So access, I already mentioned that. So they focus on access, responsiveness, and quality. Access, as I said, it's financial, geographic, and information. Responsiveness is about courtesy of treatment, the match to special needs, so kind of tailor-made or a kind of focus to citizens, and the timeliness. And the quality part is about the effectiveness of the delivery, the consistency of the delivery, and the security, the safety of the delivery. So these are elements which OECD is trying to map and link it to trust. Again, the graph you will see is a bit too complex perhaps for the audience, and I apologize for that. But it's actually about trust in government, trust in the civil service, trust in parliament, and trust in the police. You should know that in general, in Western liberal democracies, trust in central government is lower than trust in local government. And in general, trust in the civil service is higher than trust in politicians. That's a general statement. Can be high, high, or low, low, depending on the culture of the country. And here we can see that for the Portuguese part, you are above the OECD average. And Brazil is also on this graph here, is actually, this is the figures from 2021 here, is showing some challenges as we can imagine. The scorecard, and I am now aware that you probably will not be fully able to read this, or fully able not to read this. It's actually about health, education, and justice. I just will tell you what's on the graph. And you can immediately imagine also the colors are very visible: green, orange, and red. So it's a kind of very flashy way to look at it, and you will see it. So for Portugal on the justice side, it's about access and about alternative dispute resolution. For Portugal, Brazil is not on this graph here. For Portugal, it's quite clear that you are the 14th in access in the listing of OECD and going upwards compared to the previous year. And as far as ADR, alternative dispute resolution, you are actually at the same level here. I think I will, just because it perhaps may be a bit difficult to observe it, but also there is not always data available. So you see, only for education, we can say something about responsiveness. For the Portuguese case, actually, I just will summarize it. You are 14th for timeliness, and you are 23rd, which is perhaps not a very good position for timeliness in administrative cases. But I just will move to the last part of our slide. So they did the same for the quality of the services here. Let me go to the end of my intervention here. It's on effectiveness and fairness. And so the slide you will see is a graph which actually on the x-axis shows the people that do not resort to violence to redress personal grievances. So it's actually about people who are saying, I don't get justice, so I will solve the case myself, right? And the other is the criminal adjudication is timely and effective. So actually, so to see that, so if you look at this graph here, countries which have less effectiveness, perceived effectiveness, there the population is willing to solve the case itself through violence. I think this is a very telling graph here, and I think the best countries there up to the right, upper part, right, it's the Scandinavian countries which are doing very well from that point of view. And in the middle part is actually Italy, Portugal, France, Spain. It's a kind of middle cluster. And so you have this distribution here, which actually is quite telling how important justice and the quality of justice is for the quality of life in general. Now, let me summarize. That's the last slide, which I will show. From trusting just reforms to trusting justice and reform in justice. So the first element which you will observe is that when we look at the reform agenda in OECD countries, there has been a shift from focusing initially on the executive, then adding reform in the legislative, then adding to reforms in the judicial. So the judicial has been the last branch of our society, of our public sector, of our state, to be aware or to be sensitive or to be open to reforms. And of course, that has its implications. And I think not just for the reforms within justice, but also the reforms, the coherence of the reforms between executive, legislative, and judicial. They should be coherent, they should be consistent, they should be consolidated. And so we need to have the same dynamics and the same drivers for that reform. And the basic elements, of course, should be results, reform for results, and reform for appropriate institutions, which together could lead to trust. Because it's conditional. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so to only focus on results is necessary, but insufficient. And it's asymmetrical. So if you have the right service delivery and the good service delivery, that could contribute to trust. If you have bad service delivery and with exclusion and no inclusion, it certainly will affect distrust. So it's an asymmetrical functioning of what is happening. I mentioned the exogenous and endogenous variables. It actually means you have no control over the full picture. That's the element here. So service delivery is necessary but not sufficient. And we have to look not just at quality as such, but also the perception of quality, the expectations, the satisfaction. That is an important element. Justice should be done, but it should be seen to be done. And that's why we need perception management or perception government. We need expectations management. We need satisfaction management. And finally, to conclude, ability, benevolence, and integrity. We have to look at these three things simultaneously. It's about competences, competent judicial apparatus in a competent public sector, which is part of the solution. Benevolence, goodwill, public interest. You want to contribute to the public interest. And the third is integrity. Individual integrity, organizational integrity, and policy integrity, which is ultimately about inclusion, and that marries consequences and appropriateness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, if you...
That slides were a bit too detailed.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just say thank you to ENAJUS and to Lara for the very kind invitation. Also to say that it's a very important topic, and I'm very pleased to share the panel with Geert that I've cited so many times. Work on public trust and public integrity is a world reference on these issues. So it's certainly a pleasure to be in the same panel with her. Both topics are in a way related, as Geert has already mentioned. Let me just say that this paper is part of a research project, an ongoing research project at the Institute of Social Sciences. It's funded by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology and coordinated by Pedro Magalhães and myself. The paper or the results of the analysis that I'll present today, they've been still being written by 4 authors. So I'm just one of them. It's a teamwork. It's work in progress. We're just going to show some exploratory analysis we're doing with recent survey data on the case of Portugal. So it's an individual level analysis, a bit different from what Geert has just presented. It's not country level analysis. So it's just focused on the case of Portugal and uses individual level data. Okay. Let me just start stating the obvious. Corruption is a very complex societal challenge. We all know that. We all know that this phenomenon has multiple impacts at the financial level, at the organization level, at the reputational level. And it hinders, it undermines institutional trust, as Geert has already mentioned, and also the notion of procedural justice. So the resilience of corruption in society depends to a large extent on how this phenomenon is perceived, both by office holders, insiders, as well as outsiders, citizens at large. So in order to respond effectively to this challenge, we certainly need to understand how people reason about corruption, how they think about corruption, how they understand the various definitional components of this complex phenomenon, its causes, its impacts, consequences, but also how they interact with the phenomenon, the experiences. And we've been trying to assess this for the last 30 years through several surveys. The European Commission just launched a few years ago a new special Eurobarometer fully dedicated on corruption, focusing on citizens' perceptions, but there's also a flash Eurobarometer that looks at the more specific opinion of businessmen. So we're taking this seriously, both in academic terms and also at the policy level. And in order to capture all these nuances, we need to collect information from individuals. There are several ways we can do it, but there are certainly 2 that are very effective and that we've been using for the past few years: surveys and experimental studies. In this project, we have both. The purpose of this project was to assess people's perceptions in context of crisis. We didn't know that the pandemic was going to happen. It's good in academic terms, it's bad in terms in societal terms, but the fact is that this crisis is even more complex than the previous one. And for us, it's obviously it's an environment that's very interesting because we are able to collect data at different points in time and see the effect of the evolution of the pandemic in people's perceptions. Right, I'll just focus on survey data today. We do have some experimental data. We carried out a conjoint experiment embedded in the survey, but this is not what I will talk about today. I'll focus on the reasons that people invoke for not reporting corruption and why is it important. And I focus mostly on two reasons that have not been two factors that have not been taken too much into account in previous studies on whistleblowing. So we depart from the assumption that citizens have a role to play in the fight against corruption. I mean, the United Conventions mentions that any kind of convention you read, it underlines the role of citizenship, of citizens in the fight against corruption. And there's, I mean, it can play different roles, but there's certainly two of them that are meaningful. One is, let's say at the systemic level, citizens can punish corruption at the ballot box. They can signal that they don't like certain types of conduct in office. Obviously, this is valid for elective officials, not to permanent civil servants, but there are also ways that you address your discontent to civil servants through evaluation cards, etc. So electoral punishment of corruption is not today's topic. But it does create incentives for integrity in politics. The other role that citizens play that's quite meaningful in the fight against corruption is by reporting corruption. And this takes place mostly in organizational contexts. And so the importance that this kind of attitude generates constraints to misconduct. So the more you report, the more you signal this kind of risks or occurrences, the more you're willing to collaborate with audit or investigative bodies, the more constraints you create to a conduct that it's quite opaque, as we know. It's quite difficult to detect. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Why citizens refuse to report corruption by using a survey data from Portugal. I mean, studies for the past few years, they've uncovered a wide range of institutional and cultural constraints that depend negatively on citizens' decision to report corruption. And there's been quite substantive research on various organizational factors that are likely to affect the employees' willingness to make disclosures. But there's been less attention to how people actually understand what is or what is not corruption when they see it, because they have to make a judgment. And also, although there was some indication, there are some recent studies that look into the employment status of the individuals as an inhibitor. We know from previous studies, for instance, one that we carried out for the Central Department of Criminal Investigation in Portugal some years ago. We looked at over 800 court cases in first instance courts on corruption and related offenses. And it became clear that when reports were done anonymously, there was a high percentage of those reports would simply be dismissed by either lack of evidence or insufficient information in those reports. If the reports were made from inside the service where the occurrence was detected, the likelihood of reaching a trial stage was very high, which means that if public officials are available to collaborate with justice and provide information, signal risks, signal concrete occurrences to judicial authorities, the probabilities that this case will go to the final stages and eventually get sanctioned. So it's very important to create conditions for people at the workplace to report corruption and to report corruption safely. We also know from a previous study in 2006, another survey, that 2 out of the 3 major reasons for not reporting corruption had to do with organizational aspects. People feared the reprisals, or they thought it was irrelevant to report. So we knew that, and we decided, okay, let's explore a little bit more the reasons people have for not reporting corruption. So we looked at the literature, and as I said, the organizational factors have somehow been mapped, inadequate internal reporting channels and procedures, the fact that you have organizational cultures that are non-participatory, that are very hierarchical, that are opaque, are not very transparent. Obviously, these conditions are not do not offer a context of safety for reporting corruption. Lack of trust on those individuals or bodies that are entrusted with the collection or handling of information. If you don't trust the person that you're supposed to talk to and to report corruption, obviously that's a problem. And also the poor tracking handling those situations. I mean, if you know that someone has already reported before you and he got in dire straits, you don't want to report. It's just not an invitation to report. Research also shows that the more employees regard the duty to report corruption as part of their prescribed work, and so they appropriate these as not just an obligation, but as something that it's expected from them in the discharge of public duties, and the more the peers expect such virtuous conduct, then the greater the propensity to disclose any kind of wrongdoing or risks of misconduct. So looking at the literature, we identified 2 gaps. One had to do with the job situation of the individual. We know that precarious employment is on the rise. There are several studies that show that employees with atypical forms of contracts are in general more vulnerable, not just vulnerable in terms of reporting misconduct, but overall. But we have very scarce evidence combining job precariousness and people's willingness to report corruption. The second gap is that despite the paraphernalia of deontological charters, codes of conduct, legal frameworks, prescribing and prohibiting certain types of conduct, there's still not an overall consensus regarding some of these norms when applied to specific cases. We see that time after time regarding the reception of gifts, hospitality, conflicts of interest, how to handle them. So we still have this difficulty in finding a broad consensus in terms of the application. Of course, certain codes of conduct are more detailed about what should be done in a specific situation. I'm not just saying you should be a virtuous person, you should be transparent, but what does it mean? So the fact that this can have a significant impact in the scope and type of corruption that is identified and eventually reported at the workplace, it's very important. So there's now some recent studies that try to assess how citizens' perception-based definitions of corruption can affect the signaling and the reporting of a given conduct or action as corrupt, or at least as potentially corrupt. And these two gaps basically were the objectives of this study. We wanted to contribute to the literature, so we draw on original data from a survey which was conducted at the beginning of 2021, March, April. And so the aim of our paper, which is currently being reviewed, is to inquire about individual level factors explaining the unwillingness the unwillingness to report corruption, or the reasons invoked by citizens for not reporting corruption. So we have two types of determinants: work-related factors, which include the employment status of the individual, whether it's from the public or the private sector, the job precariousness in terms of contract security, and the professional category of the individual. Because obviously, I mean, we take from the literature that individuals, lower rank officials, are more exposed to pressure than senior, although it's not linear. And we're going to show this in a minute. And the second component, perception-based definitions of corruption. The way people basically understand, the way they define what is or what is not corruption. So the paper is very simple. We just have two hypotheses. Then we divide the first one, obviously, into these different aspects regarding the employment-related factors. We basically we believe active employees have more reasons for not reporting corruption. Employees with job precariousness also have more reasons for not reporting corruption. Public sector employees have lesser reasons for not reporting, not only because it's part of their duties, but because there's also training in that direction. There's the expectancy that public officials appropriate those norms and serve and eventually report risks or occurrences of corruption when they see them. And the professional categories also. We say that higher professional categories have fewer reasons not to report than low-ranking employees. The second hypothesis has to do with perception-based definitions. And basically what we say is that the more encompassing the definition an individual holds, the more willing he is to report. If he's, let's say, if he sticks if he holds a definition that is closer to the penal definition and it excludes from the label of corruption a series of other conducts which are not necessarily crime but still perceived as misconduct in office, then the likelihood is that he won't report them. So just to make sure, there's a slight delay, I just noticed.
Yes.
Okay. Changed. But still, so just a very brief note on the methods. Before we implemented this survey study, we conducted 6 focus groups, 4 with students in their final year, first-degree students, in disciplinary areas where they are in contact with the topic of corruption or public integrity as part of their syllabi. So we had a focus group with students from third-year students in public administration, law, economics, and political science. We also conducted 2 additional focus groups with lifelong learning students, because we also wanted the experiential knowledge of these issues, not just the academic knowledge. Most of the students at the university, of course, they still do not have professional experience, so it made sense to organize 2 additional. And the idea of the focus groups was to inform the revision of the design of the survey. We had other instruments informing the design of the survey. We had a previous survey in 2006. We did a massive benchmarking of surveys worldwide. We have that database now available for other researchers. We did an extensive systematic literature review. So we had other elements to help us designing the survey, but the focus groups were also a key element. And in fact, we extracted some very useful information from those meetings for this question in particular about the reasons for not reporting corruption. For instance, one of the reasons which was not in the 2006 survey, and it's now in this new survey, is the empathy towards the wrongdoer. It does happen. If you're in a small company or in a small organizational context, doesn't mean it could be a company or even a public servant, and you know this person's life, you work with this person every day, you know the problems he or she has gone through, maybe she got divorced or got divorced, and there's, you know the situation, you saw it happening, but you don't want to this person to suffer severe consequences regarding this misconduct. Now, the thing is, there should be alternative ways of addressing this without necessarily immediately jumping to the penal arena, but unfortunately there isn't. So they know the risk, and they have this empathy towards wrongdoing. The other element that came out from the focus groups was the empathy, was the feeling that if I reported, this might have a negative impact, a reputational impact on my company or service, and indirectly it will have consequences for me as well, which makes sense. Imagine if someone reports in a small company and that has a negative reputational impact on the company shuts down, he loses his job. That's probably not the same for a public official, but I can see the private employee having more difficulties in dealing with this situation. So for our dependent analysis, which is a question on how many reasons or what kind of reasons would you invoke for not reporting corruption. And we had a list, and we had an open answer for those who spontaneously said that they would always report corruption. Why? Let me just give you some context on this. It's a very technical issue, but it's important because it explains how sensitive the issue is for public opinion. In 2006, we asked people, would you report a case of corruption that you came to knowledge? And we had like 70-something% of the respondents saying, yes, I would. And only 20-something, 30% said, no, I wouldn't. For those who said, no, I wouldn't, then we would ask the reasons. And we had a set of predefined reasons, and we also had an open option for additional reasons. But most of them concentrated on the ones that were already expected, because this question has also been asked in other surveys, so we knew that. This year, we decided to do the opposite. Immediately ask the reasons for not reporting. And then just leave the option, if someone says spontaneously, no. With me, I always report corruption. Because this way you go directly to what is really troubling you, which is the fact that some people are unwilling to report, and to the reasons. It worked well because only 1% actually said spontaneously that they would report corruption. So we just, in 2006, we had the problem of social desirability. So we just overcame this issue with this new way of phrasing the question. So we performed the principal component analysis for our question on reasons for not reporting corruption, and we created a single measure. And then we conducted a regression analysis, which I will show you. And we added the independent variables to the estimation in a stepwise manner. So let me show you the results. This is our database. It's representative sample of the Portuguese population. The survey was conducted by Matrix GfK. We have variables on gender, age, education. I mean, it's all standard. And it was conducted from January to May. I'm sorry, I said March, April, but January to May. It's the right date of the field work. So this is the descriptive analysis of our dependent variable, of the reasons for not reporting corruption. Oops, there's a delay.
There's always a delay.
I can't move forward because it's an image. So you really have to see the results. I can start saying a little bit about the results of the dependent variable. The three main reasons for not reporting corruption are quite similar to the ones we had in 2006. And they are mostly linked to organizational aspects. So the inconsequence of reporting is the first one. Nothing useful will be done about it. The second reason, it's a cost benefit calculation. So people say, I mean, the costs outweigh the benefits. So I'm sorry, I'm not reporting. And the third one, which is partly related with the first two, is fear of reprisals. It's there again. So the three main reasons have to do with the way the procedures and the mechanisms for reporting corruption are in place in Portugal. And the fourth is also related because for 10% of the respondents, they do not know to whom they should report. It's quite a big margin. So if we look at the independent variables, the one that had to do with our second hypothesis, the definitions of corruption, the perception-based definitions of corruption. So people's understandings whether this fact or that fact or this conduct is corruption or not, whether they label it as corruption or not. We grouped these, we had 11 integrity scenarios. We grouped them in 3 categories. There's what we call black corruption. In the literature is often related to those types of corruption that are closer to the penal definition of corruption. We corruption for licit purposes, corruption for illicit purposes, abuse of power and embezzlement. Then we had gray corruption, those situations where there is manipulation of decisional, legislative, or regulatory power. There might be collusion between public and private interests, but we still have, and there's some degree of regulation of these kind of conducts, but there might be some legal ambiguity in interpreting the norms. And white corruption, those forms that are more culturally acceptable, like kind of hospitality, nepotism, pulling strings. I mean, things that have to do with what we call investive corruption, social capital corruption. So we build our independent variable through these integrity scenarios into these 3 categories. And these are the results of our regression in a minute. So in green, in this table, you will see the variables that have an impact on our dependent variable and that have explanatory potential. So yes, we confirm that public officials or employees in the public sector, that's the proper way, have less reasons, invoke less reasons for not reporting corruption than the private ones. So we confirm our one of our sub-hypotheses. The model also tells that precariousness, job precariousness, does have an impact. Precisely in the direction that we were expecting. So we are confirming, unfortunately, we are confirming what was our expectations. The more precarious people are at the workplace, the less incentives they have or willingness to report corruption. And then we looked at the definitions people hold. And we noticed that for those respondents that have a definition that is closer to the penal definition and therefore exclude a series of other conducts which are not crime but still unethical, the willingness to report is lower. And those who have more a more broader, more embracive definition, which also includes even those lighter forms such as pulling strings, hospitality, nepotism, etc. They are more willing to report corruption. We then decided to do an interaction between job precariousness and the professional category of the individuals, because nowadays, as we said, atypical contracts are quite diffuse. So it affects not just low-ranking officials, but also senior officials or senior employees. And when we do the interaction, it's interesting to see that if you're a high-rank official or employee, job precariousness doesn't really matter. doesn't collide with the, doesn't create constraints for not reporting corruption. So in a way, it makes sense because this individual probably has higher levels of education, and we had set of other control variables, as you can see, gender, age, level of income, education, and we're now going to introduce in the revised model, but I didn't have time to bring it to you, the variations over the territory. So we're going to have fixed territory effect in this model. So I was saying the fact that you might have an atypical contract, but you're a very senior position, and this is exploratory because we know from other studies it's not always the case, but our data at least is suggesting this, that you have less reasons for not reporting, probably because you feel more the case that I may report if things go wrong, I can move elsewhere. Now, it's not always the case, as we know, and it may create also contrary to what we would expect, that this will be a plus, another value in your CV. But it may be, well, the opposite. This is the guy who has turned up and reported in this company. We don't want them here. We don't want to have troubles. So it may become unwelcome skill feature of that individual in his CV. But I think we need to explore more. This is data, as I said, from a survey. This is not data collected at the workplace in an organizational context. I think we need to explore some of these possible explanations in experimental studies. And looking at, for instance, in the private sector, looking at employees from large companies and also small and medium-sized companies. We have a large small and medium-sized sector. We also have micro firms, new micro firms in new areas called the startups. The startups have a different culture, a different managerial culture. It's also a different age group. So it would be interesting to see how things work in different organizational contexts. Unfortunately, this was not the aim of the project. This is just one of the products coming out from this project. So it works survey data at the population level and not at specific sectors or workplace level. But I mean, just to conclude that we basically confirmed our worst fears. That in terms of whistleblower protection, although we have extended in the Portuguese legislation also due to the new EC directive, but even before that, we had extended the protection to whistleblowers to employees in the private sector, which initially it was not foreseen. It was the OECD pushed for this change, but still, public sector employees feel more comfortable than private sector ones reporting. So again, this needs to be probably explored in more detail, this causality in experimental study. We also noticed that the issue of precariousness, it is an issue. That if people feel insecure, they will fear reprisals, and therefore they will not be available for collaborating with either internal audit or external audit and judicial investigations. if they do it anonymously, we already know that unless the anonymous report is so well informed, otherwise it will not be taken seriously. It's just dismissed. I mean, as I said, the rate was very high. I know that this online platform that the Central Department has for reporting corruption anonymously, that there's a lot of trust there. I mean, there's a lot of reports that are useless, just people saying, you know, there's a bunch of criminals around there, just get them. You can't do much with that. But there are also reports, well-informed ones, that come anonymously, and therefore we should make sure that they do it securely, and that all the fears that these platforms might expose them by identifying their ID number, etc., that should be clear information that this is not the case. Anyway, job precariousness, definitely confirmed that it's a problem. And the fact that you may have a typical contracts over the board, including high ranking, I'm still not confident about the results that high ranking but precarious employees have lesser reasons for not reporting. But yes, what is the medium longer term effect for this individual? Because if he does expose and he has no fear in doing so, it gets out to the market, to the job market, and he will be known for being a whistleblower. If that's the case, then it might get complicated to get a job, at least in the sector. So anyway, there are issues there that we still have to disentangle. But I think it nevertheless, it has tested two interesting hypotheses which were still insufficiently explored in the literature. The link, the job employment factors as possible constraints, inhibitors of whistleblowing, and the way people perceive corruption as also a possible facilitator or inhibitor of whistleblowing, because obviously the way you perceive corruption, if it's not so abrasive, you may end up tolerating a series of conducts that would otherwise be reported. And so I conclude. I thank you for your attention, and I'm willing to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you both. So yes, let's open the floor to questions. Let's start here by taking some questions from the floor, let's say.
Well,
Pedro.
thank you very much. I have a question for each one of the professors. Professor Gert, it was wonderful to listen to your. Thank you, Professor Gert. It was wonderful to listen to your presentation. I have a question. One of my main research interests has to deal with satisfaction and loyalty of citizens towards justice, loyalty measured somewhat like you mentioned in your presentation. Not even if I am dissatisfied, I'm not. I'm willing to go to court and not do justice by my own hands. And the question is, what do we notice in Portugal when we study satisfaction of the justice sector, health sector, and educational sector, as you mentioned? We notice this phenomenon. People who use these services are far more satisfied with them than the ones that only know about them through the media. So if I have never been to court, I have an awful image of justice because I only hear about the 2 or 3 media cases of the the banker who ran away from the country, some other scandals. If I, in other instance, use the courts, have been to court, I think that the judge was fair, the employees are well prepared, the facilities are not that bad. So this happens in these three sectors, particularly in the justice sector. So I was wondering if you have some intuition that the same happens with trust. If one uses the services, one has a greater deal of trust in those services, and if one only hears about them in the news, level of trust is low. To Professor Luís, thank you as well for your presentation. A few years ago, I wrote a paper with Professor João Godinho, a PhD student, about codes of ethics in the health sector in Portugal. And one of the conclusions was it's not really about if the services have an ethics code, most of them have, but it's what we do, what the services do with those codes of ethics. And one of the main conclusions, most of the services who have the code of ethics put them in the beautiful case in the drawer, and the employees never heard of it. No sessions of information of employees, no circulation of them of the ethics code. What I would ask of you, I'm very interested in reading your finished paper, as well for methodological reasons. I totally agree with the principal component analysis you use. I'm a little bit more skeptic about the OLS for some reasons of scale. I'm sure you took all the precautions. My point, what I would like you to comment is, my instinct tells me that corruption begins with us. There's some results, some very interesting results from psychology that say if you are corrupt to about a certain percentage, let's say 10%, we go to bed at night thinking that we are a wonderful person. So I believe that maybe that's the case, the generalized case. I will use a kind of a joke. You probably know that joke that some parent is called to the school of his son because he stole a pencil, and he says to his son, "You shamed your father, you shamed your family. How could you steal a pencil? That is awful." And in the way they go home, and the father continues with this discourse. And at the end of the day, he says to his son, "By the way, a pencil. You know perfectly well I could bring 10 pencils from you from office." So I believe that's the human spirit, and I would like to sort of a general comment in this regard that corruption begins with us, and we are all about 10% corrupt, and corruption is also an issue with others. But if we look in the mirror, probably we are not that innocent. So thank you. Thank you.
I don't know. Whoever wants to go first.
Is it captured? My voice?
Maybe you have to talk a little bit louder, but that's okay. No, but it does capture, yeah.
Okay.
Or
Yes.
I can just. Oops,
Yes,
sorry.
okay, that's right. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for this question. I think the link between using services and satisfaction has to be unpacked. And the best example is fire services. We all hope never to have to use it. And you must know that the satisfaction rate, when you do surveys on satisfaction for service delivery, what the highest is in many countries is fire services. And still you hope, it's not based on use.
Exactly.
Right. And so there's a disconnection actually. And so what you have to do is in the service delivery, you have to look at different roles. There is the decision to use the service. There is the use of the service. There is the benefit, the person that benefits from the service. And you have to unpack this. You see it with kindergartens. Who benefits from the kindergarten? Not the kids. No, it's the grandparents or the parents, right? And so prisons. Who is the user of the prison? Is it the prisoner or is it society? Is it this generation or next generation? So actually, you have to qualify the link between service delivery and the different role models, the roles that are played to use to satisfy. That's the first qualification. And so you have to actually measure satisfaction with what? With the decision, with the use, with the payments, who pays for the service, who gets the service, who benefits from the service, and that's different. The second thing is on the link between trust and satisfaction. So is it the case that, the link between, we did research on that, empirical research on satisfaction, low, average, high, and trust, low, average, high. What we observed is that there is a kind of very permanent group in our society. This was in Flanders, but you could actually do it for specific services too, who are constantly very low satisfaction and low trust. We looked at who are they, and actually the common denominator was not age or education. It was they all voted for extreme right-wing parties.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really a very determined niche of people. And of course, you have to know, in our case, it was about 11% of the population. And so you have to know them and control them. And that brings me to Hirschman. Hirschman made a distinction between how do people react: exit, voice, and loyalty. And exit is extreme right-wing behavior, hooliganism, even migration. So that's the behavior there. The other side is high satisfaction, high trust. These are mostly senior citizens. That's loyalty there. And the group in between is voice. They protest, they write letters to the editor, they go to protest, they would complain and deliver, because that's an issue also in your case. Yeah. Are they exit, are they loyalty, or are they voice? Because declaring corruption is voice. Yeah. And so that's the lay. But in average, our research said people are in average more satisfied than trusting. And that's also a kind of, so it's not a one-to-one relationship between satisfaction and trust. Over to you.
In fact, I wanted just to pick first on a question that was directed to Geert, because we do have data that tells the opposite. And we did carry out surveys in Portugal that actually said that people who experience WFX at certain point in their lives interacted with justice have even a worse level of satisfaction with justice. And so it was not the opposite, in the sense that I understand what you're saying, that people are exposed to media effects, and so they just have an opinion about something they've never interacted with. And that's actually not the case from data we collected on the quality of democracy in 2011. Okay, it's some years ago, but there were questions precisely on that with different indicators for quality of rule of law. And we noticed that the perception was more negative for those who had experienced and interacted with the justice system. But it only means that we still have to do more research on this issue. Regarding the whether corruption begins with us from within at the individual level, well, both individual and institutional level. Certainly, it's a conduct, it's a behavior, it's a practice. Therefore, we cannot exclude that it depends on how people perceive norms, how they perceive the expectations in relation to discharge of duties that have been trusted to them. And therefore, there may be different, as I said earlier, different interpretations of these codes of ethics, of these norms, etc. And that's where the institution comes in. As you said, there are institutions who adopted this code of ethics, but have them in drawers, and there are institutions who did something about it and maybe created an ethics counselor, an advisor, someone you could talk to if you have a problem, or if you feel you are in an ethical dilemma and you're not able by yourself or by consulting peers to solve this ethical dilemma. Now, if the institution doesn't provide those means, it's hopeless. It's up for you to decide in sometimes in a very constraining situation that you just have to take action, but you don't know and you fear that you're going to make the right decision. Obviously, when the institution is not present, I say that whatever decision you take, it's a good decision because you've thought about it. That's how you felt you should have acted, but we know that it's not always the case. Yes, there's some normalization of misconduct, not just at the workplace, in society overall. I mean, we have a set of questions in the survey, very abstract, but conceptual, about the social understandings, social definitions of corruption. One of them asks people whether corruption is what the law says to be corruption. So here we're measuring the deontological dimension of corruption. Either you put yourself in the scale that corruption is only what the penal code says it's corruption, and therefore you exclude a series of conducts which are unethical, even if they're not crime, or you put yourself on the other side of the scale. You have a more expansive, more all-encompassing definition. So I say you higher moral being. Then you have three other questions at the output level, not at the process level. Is this process? Either corruption is what the law says, or it's something more than that. But in terms of outcome, so consequentialist ethics. And here we ask whether corruption is what everybody says corruption is. It's not corruption if it's done for a just cause, and it's not corruption if it has positive externalities to the community. There are three ways of normalizing corruption, of accepting corruption on the basis of the outcomes. And yes, a lot of people, even if they might judge at the deontological level certain act as corruption, in terms of outcome, in terms of consequentialist ethics, they relativize. So if you have a mayor who has asked 5% commissions on each public procurement, each tender he has, and he has told the winner that it's not for me, you don't pay me the 5%, but you're going to deposit those 5% in the bank account of a charity, a local charity, of which maybe he's the director. And the local charity provides for healthcare to old folks in the community. And people say, yes, I understand that maybe this is a crime. You're not entitled to ask 5% of each contract. But, you know, the outcome is good. It's for the old folks. And the state is not intervening. We need people to take care of it. So, you know, it's a way of sponsoring. You see these dilemmas, this discrepancy between how we perceive corruption at the abstract level, at the sociotropic level, and how we perceive corruption at the strategic level. It can be discrepant.
Okay, so we already passed our time. So thank you again hugely for having accepted our invitation and for your brilliant talks. It was a huge pleasure. And I'm so sorry that I cannot take any more questions. There are some questions. There were some questions on YouTube, but we have to end here. And thanks again, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Lara.
Thank you, Lara.